Hello and welcome. In this episode, we will look at how Russia's war in Ukraine, which was supposed to be short and decisive, has turned into a long and costly struggle that is now creating a serious time pressure for the Kremlin. We will walk through the key external and internal factors that are steadily closing the window of opportunity for Moscow, and why the Russian leadership is increasingly forced to speed up its actions, take more risks, and escalate on multiple fronts. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine at the end of February 2022, the expectation in Moscow was that the entire operation would be fast, limited, and manageable. The plan assumed that Ukrainian resistance would collapse in a matter of days, that the government in Kiev would either flee or fall, and that any Western reaction would be slow and hesitant. In other words, the leadership in the Kremlin believed that time was on Russia's side. A few weeks, perhaps a couple of months at most, were seen as enough to secure control, impose a political settlement, and then absorb whatever sanctions the West was willing to impose. That assumption proved to be fundamentally wrong. By March 2022, it was already clear that the initial objectives had failed. Ukrainian forces held Kiev, the political leadership stayed in place, and society rallied around the defense of the state. The rapid decapitation strike that was supposed to bring Ukraine to its knees simply did not work. Instead of a short, tightly controlled campaign, Russia found itself in a much larger and more complex war, facing a determined opponent that was increasingly supported by outside powers. The idea that this conflict would be a quick, special military operation disappeared. What remained was an extended war of attrition, one that demanded far more resources, manpower, and time than the original planners had anticipated. This shift transformed the nature of the conflict. Rather than a contest decided in a few decisive battles, it became a long struggle whose outcome would depend on industrial capacity, financial resilience, and the willingness of outside states to provide assistance. At that point, another crucial factor came into play: the role of the broader international community. From early on, the war stopped being just a bilateral clash between Russia and Ukraine, and became a test of how much support Ukraine could mobilize from its partners, versus how much backing Russia could secure from its own allies and economic partners. The longer the war lasted, the more the balance of these external contributions mattered. The collective West, especially the United States, and the countries of the European Union, quickly became indispensable to Ukraine's ability to sustain the war. They provided air defense systems, artillery, armored vehicles, training, financial aid, and help in keeping the Ukrainian state functioning under conditions of war. Over time, the scale of this support became enormous, reaching hundreds of billions of euros in military, financial, and humanitarian assistance. This external backing did not allow Ukraine to win a fast victory, but it prevented a quick defeat. Every month that Ukraine continued to fight undermined the early Russian assumption that time would favor Moscow. On the Russian side, the failure to achieve a decisive result in the first weeks forced the Kremlin to look for external support of its own. It increasingly turned to countries willing to help offset Western pressure, both militarily and economically. North Korea and Iran emerged as key suppliers of ammunition, artillery shells, and drones. These supplies filled critical gaps created by the intense rate of Russian fire and the high consumption of material on the front lines. At the same time, China played a subtler but essential role, providing a vital economic lifeline through the purchase of large volumes of Russian energy and the export of dual-use goods, and components that could be integrated into Russia's defense industry and broader economy. However, there is a deeper issue behind this pattern of external support. The fact that Russia, a state that had long positioned itself as a major military power, increasingly relied on outside donors for ammunition, technology, and economic stability, is itself a strategic vulnerability. It shows that the war effort is not fully sustainable on domestic resources alone. The longer the war continues, the more this dependence grows, and the more leverage these partner states potentially gain over Moscow. Instead of time strengthening Russia's position, every additional year adds to the burden of maintaining this network of external support and adjusting to Western sanctions. Against this backdrop, one of the most important missed opportunities for the Kremlin was the return of Donald Trump to the White House. In Moscow, the expectation throughout 2023 was that a new Trump presidency could dramatically shift the political landscape surrounding the war. The hope was that Washington would reduce its support for Kyiv, pressure Ukraine to accept an unfavorable settlement, or at the very least, introduce enough uncertainty and delays to weaken Ukrainian defenses. From the Kremlin's perspective, the arrival of an American president who was openly critical of NATO burden sharing and skeptical of long-term commitments abroad looked like a strategic gift. In the early months after Trump's return to office, there were moments that seemed to confirm these hopes. There were tense meetings between Trump and President Vladimir Zelensky, sharp public statements, and periods when military aid and intelligence sharing were paused or put under review. Commentators across Europe and Ukraine worried that United States support might be scaled back dramatically or even cut off, leaving Ukraine dangerously exposed. For a time, it appeared that Russia's strategy of simply waiting for a more favorable political environment in Washington might pay off. But that is not what happened. Over the course of 2025, the relationship between Trump and Putin deteriorated rather than improved. The Russian leadership appeared so confident that the United States would eventually distance itself from Ukraine that it did little to offer meaningful concessions or gestures that could have helped keep Trump's sympathy. Instead, Moscow continued to insist on maximalist objectives, gave only vague signals about a possible ceasefire, and failed to provide any concrete steps toward de-escalation that Trump could present as a success. This created growing frustration in Washington. By mid-2025, signs of this frustration became public. Trump's language towards Putin hardened, and the administration began once again to emphasize support for Ukraine as a means of restraining Russian ambitions. The possibility of stronger sanctions on Moscow reappeared in the discussion, and ideas such as providing Ukraine with long-range cruise missiles like Tomahawks moved from the realm of speculation into active debate. What had once looked like an opening for Russia turned into the opposite. A renewed demonstration that the United States remained a central pillar of Ukraine's defense, and that the Kremlin could not simply count on political shifts in Washington to rescue its strategy. This failure to capitalize on the change of administration in the United States is one of the central reasons analysts argue that time is no longer on Russia's side. Instead of seeing support for Ukraine steadily weaken, Moscow now faces a situation in which Washington is pushing European allies to spend more on defense, deliver more weapons, and treat the conflict as a long-term security challenge. The chance to use American politics as a wedge to divide Ukraine from its main backer has largely been lost. In effect, the clock that the Kremlin thought was counting down in its favor has started to work against it. The second major development that is increasing the time pressure on Russia is the transformation of NATO's defense posture, especially in Europe. Before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the long-standing guideline within NATO was that member states should spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. Even that modest target was met by only a minority of allies. Many European governments had reduced military spending after the end of the Cold War, assuming that large land wars on the continent were unlikely, and that the United States would remain the ultimate guarantor of their security. Russia's invasion changed that calculation. As the war dragged on and the scale of the fighting in Ukraine became clear, European leaders were forced to confront the possibility that their own defenses were inadequate. Over several years, a growing number of NATO members passed the 2% threshold. Then, in response to pressure from Washington and the evolving threat from Russia, allies went much further and agreed on an ambitious plan to raise defense and security-related spending to 5% of gross domestic product by the middle of the next decade. This is a historic shift. It represents not just a marginal increase, but a fundamental reorientation of European budgets and industrial priorities. For Russia, this is extremely bad news over the long term. The combined economic weight of the European members of NATO is many times larger than that of Russia. Even a relatively small additional share of European output directed toward defense results in a volume of spending that Moscow simply cannot match. Analysts have pointed out that if Europe dedicated only a fraction of 1% of its total economic output specifically to Ukraine, that alone could offset or surpass what Russia is able to invest in its war effort in a given year. As the 5% pledge takes effect, the gap in conventional capabilities, munitions production, and defense technology will widen dramatically. This shift does not instantly change the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine because new factories, procurement programs, and training pipelines take time to build. But it has enormous strategic implications. It means that looking ahead over the next decade, Russia will face an increasingly well-armed and better prepared NATO on its western flank, with stockpiles of weapons and ammunition that dwarf anything Moscow can produce. The war in Ukraine has therefore had the unintended consequence of mobilizing Europe to rearm on a scale not seen in generations. The longer the conflict continues, the more this rearmament will mature and the harder it will be for Russia to threaten its neighbors or impose its will by force. Russia still retains an advantage in one area: its nuclear arsenal. In terms of the number of nuclear warheads, Russia possesses more than all the European nuclear powers combined. Within NATO's European members, only France and the United Kingdom have nuclear forces, and their combined stockpile is far smaller than Russia's. At first glance, this might appear to give the Kremlin a powerful tool of intimidation. However, nuclear deterrence within NATO does not rest on European arsenals alone. The United States maintains a strategic nuclear force that is roughly comparable in size to Russia's, and this capability is integrated into the alliance's defense posture. As a result, any attempt by Russia to use nuclear threats to coerce European states faces a clear counterweight in the American deterrent. Instead of giving Moscow a free hand, nuclear saber-rattling tends to reinforce the perception in Western capitals that Russia is a dangerous and unpredictable actor that must be contained. Over time, repeated references to nuclear weapons have not broken Western unity. Instead, they have often had the opposite effect, strengthening the resolve of NATO members to support Ukraine and to invest more heavily in their own defense and resilience. In this sense, nuclear superiority, while real in terms of warhead counts, does not solve Russia's growing strategic problem. The third major source of time pressure on Putin is inside Russia itself. The combination of prolonged war and extensive sanctions has been placing steadily greater strain on the Russian economy. For the first few years of the conflict, the government managed to cushion the impact through a mix of currency controls, redirected energy exports, and the use of financial reserves. Official statistics were used to project an image of resilience, suggesting that Russia was adapting to the new environment and even finding ways to grow under sanctions. But as the war enters its fourth year, the limits of this approach are becoming more visible. One of the clearest signs of stress is the state budget. War is expensive, and sustaining large-scale operations in Ukraine requires a constant flow of money to pay soldiers, replace equipment, and support defense industries. At the same time, sanctions and price caps on Russian energy exports have reduced revenues, and discounts offered to buyers willing to ignore Western measures have further cut into profits. As a result, the budget deficit has grown, forcing the government to look for new sources of income. Tax increases have followed, including a rise in the value-added tax from 20% to 22%, as well as higher burdens on businesses and wealthier individuals. These measures help finance the war in the short term, but they also slow growth and feed inflation. Consumers face higher prices, companies see their margins shrink, and investors become more cautious. To free up money for defense and security spending, the state has trimmed or frozen funding for public services, including education, healthcare, and social programs. Ordinary Russians may not be taking to the streets in large numbers, but the sense that living standards are eroding is gradually spreading. For a regime that has long justified itself by promising stability and modest but steady improvements in everyday life, this is a worrying trend. At the elite level, the strains are equally serious. Many members of the political and business elite built their careers and fortunes on access to global markets, foreign assets, and the ability to travel and invest abroad. Sanctions have restricted or frozen many of these opportunities. As the war drags on, it becomes harder to believe that these losses are temporary. At the same time, the concentration of economic decision-making in the hands of the security establishment reduces the influence of technocrats who might otherwise push for reforms. Quiet doubts and frustrations begin to accumulate, even if they are rarely expressed in public. No immediate elite revolt is on the horizon, but the foundation of loyalty is eroding. The result is a kind of slow-burning deadline. The longer the war continues without a clear, favorable outcome, the more the economic and social costs will mount. Russia still has room to borrow, raise taxes further, or cut other expenditures. But each of these steps carries political risks. At some point, the balance between the perceived benefits of continuing the war and the domestic price that must be paid for it will become harder to sustain. From the perspective of the Kremlin, this means that the option of fighting indefinitely, regardless of cost, is more limited than official rhetoric suggests. Faced with these three converging pressures, the failure to leverage political change in the United States, the long-term rearmament of Europe, and mounting domestic strains, the Russian leadership appears increasingly determined to accelerate its strategy. This acceleration can be seen in both the military conduct of the war in Ukraine and in the broader confrontational posture towards NATO countries. The logic is straightforward. If the strategic environment will become more hostile over time, then the only chance to secure gains is to press harder now, even if that involves greater risks. One clear example is the pattern of Russian drone and missile activity near NATO borders. In recent months, there have been repeated incidents of Russian drones entering or leaving debris on the territory of alliance members such as Romania and Poland. These incursions have prompted those countries to strengthen their air defenses, deploy additional systems, and coordinate more closely with allies. From Moscow's point of view, such actions may be intended to test Western reactions, sow uncertainty, and send a message that the war in Ukraine can spill over into neighboring states. From the perspective of NATO capitals, however, the effect is to reinforce the sense of threat and to justify further military investments. At the same time, Russia has increased its attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, particularly as the country enters cold winter months. Waves of drones and missiles have targeted power plants, substations, and other critical facilities, leading to prolonged blackouts across many regions. These strikes aim to weaken Ukraine's economy, diminish public morale, and create pressure on Kyiv's leadership to accept a settlement on Russian terms. In practical terms, they impose real suffering on the civilian population, forcing millions of people to cope with long periods without electricity, heating, or stable access to essential services. The hope in Moscow seems to be that such hardship will translate into political advantage at the negotiating table. However, this strategy carries its own risks for Russia. Each new round of large-scale attacks on civilian infrastructure strengthens Ukraine's case for additional air defense systems, long-range weapons, and broader Western support. The more visible and dramatic the damage, the easier it is for Kyiv and its allies to argue that the war is not just a regional dispute, but a test of whether large-scale aggression and coercion will be tolerated. In this way, attempts to accelerate pressure on Ukraine and the West may end up deepening and prolonging Western engagement rather than weakening it. Parallel to these military escalations, Russian officials have also returned to more explicit discussions of nuclear modernization and deterrence. Statements by senior figures about the need to update and expand strategic forces, especially in response to American nuclear programs, are clearly intended to remind audiences at home and abroad that Russia remains a major nuclear power. They are also a signal that, as conventional options become more constrained, the leadership still views nuclear capabilities as the ultimate guarantor of national security and regime survival. Yet, as with earlier episodes of nuclear rhetoric, these signals risk being interpreted not as a sign of confidence, but as proof that the Kremlin feels cornered. Taken together, all of these trends point to a central conclusion. The war that began with the assumption that Russia enjoyed a favorable time horizon has evolved into a conflict where time increasingly works against Moscow. The missed opportunity to exploit political changes in the United States has left Ukraine's main supporter firmly engaged. The decision by NATO allies, especially in Europe, to dramatically increase defense spending has set in motion a long-term shift in the balance of conventional power. And inside Russia, the economic and social costs of the war are accumulating in ways that will be harder to manage with each passing year. In response, the Kremlin is trying to move faster, to wear down Ukraine's resilience, to frighten and divide Western societies, and to secure concrete gains on the ground before the strategic environment becomes even less favorable. But accelerating a flawed strategy does not correct its weaknesses. Instead, it magnifies the risks. The more Russia escalates, the more it justifies the very responses, both military and economic, that are making its situation more difficult over time. The window that once seemed open and wide is narrowing. And as it does, the question is no longer whether time will deliver victory to Moscow, but whether the pressure of a shrinking time frame will force the Russian leadership into choices that undermine its own position at home and abroad.